皆様、こんにちは。本日の東京カレッジイベントに参加していた
Hello
だきあり
everyone.
がとう
Thank
ご
you
ざい
very
ま
much
す。
for joining today's
私は
Tokyo
イベントの
College
司会を
event.
務めさせていただきます
My name
東京
is
カレッジ特任
Hana
助教の
Talberg
ダ
Dodd,
ル
a
ドと
project
申します。
assistant,
よろしくお願いいたし
assistant
ます。
professor at Tokyo College.
本日
I'll
のイ
be
ベントです
serving
が、実
as
はい
your
つもと
host.
違って日本語でお届けしますの
Unlike
で、
usual sessions,
まずは
we'll
ちょ
be
っと英語
conducting
で
this
させ
session in
さ
Japanese.
説
So
明
let me
させてい
first
た
give
だき
you
ま
a
し
brief
て、それから
explanation
日
in
本語に
English
戻
and
り
then I'll
ま
come
す。
back to Japanese.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Tokyo College event. My name is Hannah Dahlberg-Dodd, and a project assistant professor here in Tokyo College, and I will be serving as the moderator for today's event. Before we begin, I would like to direct your attention to the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. Today's event will be held in Japanese, so if you prefer to listen in English, please feel free to select the English button for live Japanese to English interpretation. では、日本語に戻りま
Back
す。
to Japanese.
では、本日
Now
の
I'd
ス
like
ピーカー
to
を紹介
introduce
させてい
today's
ただきたいと思
speaker.
います。まずは日韓の知識共同体を考えるという
First,
タイ
we'll
ト
have
ル
a
で、
lecture by
ヤン・
Professor
イルモ
Yang
教授
Ilmo
が講
titled
座を行っていた
Envisioning
だ
the
きま
Japan
す。
Korea
ヤン
Intellectual
教授は
Community.
東京カレ
Professor
ッジの
Yang
ヘッ
is
ド
a
論理である
visiting
と
professor
と
here
も
at
に、
Tokyo
ソ
College,
ウル国
as
立大
well
学院
as
にて教授
professor
としても
at
務められてい
Seoul
ます。
National
そ
University.
れに加え
In
て、
addition, he has
韓
served
国
as
東洋
president
哲
of
学
the
会の
Korean
会長
Society
と
for Eastern
韓国
Philosophy
哲学会の
and
次期会
is
長
the
という経歴がご
president-elect
ざいま
of
す。
the Korean
ご専門は
Philosophical
近代
Association.
中国思
His
想史、
areas of
東ア
expertise
ジア関
include
連史、
the
そ
intellectual
して
history of
韓国
modern
哲
China,
学、
the
哲学に
conceptual
なっており
history
ま
of
す。
East Asia, and
まず
Korean
ヤン教授の
philosophy.
方からレクチャーをいただ
We
き、
will
その
first have a
後、
lecture from Professor
東
Yang,
京大学大
followed
学
by
院総
comments
合
from
研究科の
Professor
石井
Ishii
剛教
Tsuyoshi
授
of the
から
Graduate School of
コメント
Arts
を
and
いただきま
Sciences
す。
at the University of
石井教
Tokyo.
授ですが、
Professor
中国哲
Ishii
学がご専
specializes
門
in
となってお
Chinese
り、
philosophy,
特に日本と
particularly in
中国
research
の間のつ
focusing
な
on
が
the
りや、それ
connections
に関する
between
テキストを
Japan
中心とし
and
て講演
China
されてい
and
ま
the
す。
related textual
石井
traditions.
先生のコメントの
After
後、
Professor
有害者
Ishii's
の考え
comments,
方
we
の
will
割の
move
ディス
on
カッ
to
シ
a
ョンに入
discussion
り、
amongst
そ
the
して時間
speakers,
があれば
and
質
if
疑
time
応答も
permits,
設け
we
たいと
will
思っており
open the
ます。
floor for Q&A.
質疑応答の際には、
During the
ズー
Q&A
ム画面の
session,
下
please
の
feel free to
Q&A
send
機能
us
を
your
使って
questions
ぜひ
using the
質問
Q&A
をお送りく
function
だ
at the
さい。
bottom of the Zoom
では、
screen.
ヤン先生、
Now,
お願いい
Professor
たしま
Yan,
す。
please.
皆さんこんにちは。
Hello, everyone.
先ほどご紹介していただいたヤンと申し
As
ます。
introduced, my name is
今日東
Yang.
京カレッジのイベントにご参加していただき、
Thank you
誠
very
にあ
much
り
for
がとうござい
joining
ます。
the Tokyo College
そ
event
れでは
today.
日韓の知識共同
Now
体
I'd
を
like
考える
to
という
speak
テー
on
マ
the
でお話し
theme
させ
of
ていただきたいと
considering
思い
the
ます。
Japan Korea intellectual community.
ごめんなさい、ちょっと問題が
Excuse
ありま
me,
した。
there are
今
some
日の
technical
講演のタイ
troubles.
トルをご覧になれば、
So if you look
私
at
の
the
結論
title
があ
of
る程度
today's lecture, you
お
may
分か
be
りいた
able
だけ
to
る
guess
かもしれません。
my conclusions to some
それ
extent.
は今こそ
That
日
is,
本と韓国
now
の間
is
に
the time to
知の
build
共同
an
体を築く
intellectual
べきであると
community
いうことで
between
す。
Japan and Korea.
この結論は一見する
This
とシンプル
is
に
a
聞こえ
conclusion
るかも
which
しれま
may
せん。
sound simple
し
at
かしなが
first
ら
glance.
知の共同
However,
体とは一
the
体どういう
question
も
of
のなの
what
かという
exactly
問いは
is an
そう
intellectual
簡単には
community
答えられ
is
ないも
not
のです。
so easy to
今から
answer.
30年ほど前、
About
東アジア共同
30
体とい
years
う言
ago,
葉
the
が一
term
時的に
East
注
Asia
目を浴びたことがあ
Community
ります。
attracted
東ア
attention
ジア地域にお
temporarily.
け
It
る協
was
力
an
体制
attempt
を
to build
構
a
築しようと
cooperative
いうもので
system
す。
in the Eastern Asia
そこで
region
いう
through
協力体
frameworks
制と
such
は、
as
まずは経済
ASEAN
共
plus
同体
3.
であり、
The
ま
cooperative
た
system referred to
次
an
は
economic
軍
community
事共同
first
体
and the
を指して
second
おり
a
ました。
military community.
経済と軍事という2つの
It
要
was
素
based
は安
on
全
the
と
idea
繁栄
that
に
the
とっ
two
て欠か
elements
せ
of
ないもの
economy
で
and
ありま
military
す。
are essential
つま
for
り生
security
命の安
and
全と
prosperity.
国家の繁
In
栄
other
というわ
words,
けです。
for safety of
けれども
life and the
約
prosperity of
30年間
nations.
を振り
However,
返ってみま
looking
すと、
back over the
東アジ
past
ア共同
30
体という
years,
スローガンは挙げられ
this,
続け
although
て
the
いたもの
slogan
の、
East Asia
実質
Community
的な
has
成
continued
果
to be
は
raised,
ごくわずかな
it
もの
can
だっ
be
た
said
と
that
言えるで
there
しょ
have been very
う。む
few
しろ
actual
東ア
results.
ジア共同
In
体という主
fact,
張が提
the
起される
term
中で、
East Asia
東アジアパラドックスとい
paradox
う言
was
葉が生
coined
まれ
when the
ました。
idea of an East Asia
この
community
言
was
葉
put
は
forward. This term of East Asia paradox refers to the phenomenon in which while economic cooperation and mutual collaboration have been progressing in the East Asian region, conflicts in the fields of politics and security continued and have become even worsened. In other words, even though East Asia community was being talked about, asymmetrical relationships were clearly evident in the economic and political fields. This is the reason why I believe we should seek a path to security and prosperity in this region that is different from practical factors such as economy and the military. This is an new community conceived from the perspective of knowledge and culture, that is, an intellectual community. There are several possible approaches to build a knowledge intellectual community between Japan and Korea. Broadly speaking, there are two approaches. One is a realistic approach, and the other is historical or philosophical approach. The realistic approach is to go back to the practices and the discussions of the East Asia community concept that have been attempted over the past 30 years, identifying the problems of that and look for clues to resolve them. This is still being undertaken by researchers in the fields of social sciences, such as politics and diplomacy. On the other hand, the historical approach is to trace the types of exchanges that Japan and Korea have had throughout history and seek to find hints for contemporary challenges in that. It is this historical or philosophical approach that I would like to share with you today. In order to examine intellectual exchange between Japan and Korea through this historical approach, I would like to introduce 4 example cases today. The first example is the relationship between Korean Confucian scholar Ganghang from the 1600s and the Edo period intellectual Fujiwara Seika. The second is an ideological connection between Edo period Confucian scholar Yamazaki Ansai and Korea's leading Confucian scholar Hwang. The third is the relationship between late Joseon intellectual Jeong Yakyong and an Edo school of classical Confucianism, including Ogyu Sorai. The fourth is the story of Fukuzawa Yukichi, a representative intellectual of modern Japan, and Giljun, a Korean intellectual who studied then in Japan. These 4 cases I will discuss today span a long period of about 400 years. Generally speaking, academic research focuses on a relatively short period of time and then delves deeply into specific issues. However, what I would like to talk about today is different from such a micro approach. Instead, I will just oppose the 4 cases from a long-term perspective of 400 years and to attempt to find a consistent trajectory of intellectual exchange. From the perspective of conventional research methodology, this method that I am applying may be considered rough. Nevertheless, I have adopted this structure because I believe that the history of intellectual exchange between Japan and Korea has been going on for a very long time, and that through these specific cases, we can gain insights that will contribute to the vision of a Japan-Korea intellectual community in the future. There are a great deal of prior researches on these 4 cases, and many specialized research papers have been published. Although there is still room for clarification as to the specific circumstances under which intellectual exchanges unfolded within the geographical, temporal, and political and historical conditions of Japan and Korea, previous research has already shed light on many facts. Based on these existing research findings, I would like to raise questions from a more macro perspective, such as why such intellectual and academic exchanges were possible, how they have continued, and what we should learn from those exchanges. Before going into the main topic, I would like to briefly talk about the people's movement from a global perspective. The history of human beings is the history of moving. The most favorite ones of yours is the sightseeing and the travels. And so these are the people's move. But then it is not just people and things that move. Culture moves too. For example, Takuan from Japan went to Korea and then it became tampon. And then Korean kimchi came to Japan to become kimchi in Japan. Those are things moving. And then not people and things only move. Culture moves too. Until now, Korean movies and dramas known as Kanryu or Korean Wave have been popular with many people in Japan. Movies and dramas are both literary and cultural products. And these days, Handu or Korean wave is very widely known. However, when I was a university student back in the 1980s, I used to secretly enjoy listening to Blue Light Yokohama by Japanese singer. Perhaps it was all the more fun because I was listening it secretly. In the 1980s, Japanese pop culture, such as manga, movies, and music, were strictly restricted by law in Korea in order to protect Korean culture and to take into consideration the public sentiment caused by the influence of the former Japanese colonial period. And then it was released under the Kim Dae-jun administrations in 1998 and onwards, and under the cultural opening policy. So those movements of people, things, and culture cannot be stopped, and even if it's tried by laws. And then those cultural movement for a short term appears to be a one-way move. For example, one-way moving from one specific country to another. However, from a long-term perspective, cultural movement is fundamentally two-way, bidirectional. Therefore, today, I would like to introduce the cultural exchanges that has been taking place between Japan and Korea over a very long period of time, particularly including academic exchanges as a two-way dynamism. Before getting into the main topic, there is one more point I would like to briefly touch upon. That is about the words used to describe Japan and Korea. An expression that is often used when talking about Japan-Korea relations is Japan-Korea relations are close, yet far away. The expression close yet far away refers to a situation in which, despite being geographically close, the relationship between the two countries is complicated, and it is difficult to become close due to historical, cultural, and political backgrounds. Indeed, this expression may be said to accurately describe the current Japan-Korea relationship in a certain sense. However, although I am not sure who started using this expression and from when, I would like to revise this expression a little. In other words, I would like to rephrase it as Japan and Korea are close and not far away. Close yet far is an logically contradictory proposition. In contrast, the expression close and not far is one way of thinking that overcomes this contradiction, isn't it? I hope that the intellectual community that I would like to talk about today will be a concrete proposal for resolving this very contradiction in a hopeful manner. Now, I would like to go into the main topic. The first case that I would like to cover out of the four cases of intellectual exchanges between Japan and Korea, its time goes back to the time of the Bunroku Keicho War. A Korean Confucian scholar named Hwang was sent to Japan as a prisoner of war when Hideyoshi invaded Korea again in 1597, and then he was placed under house arrest in Iyo, Ozu, Osaka, Fushimi, and other places. Hwang was released in the year 1600, about 3 years after arriving in Japan, and returned to his home country. He left behind a record of his experiences as a prisoner of war in Japan called Ganyo Rock, Record of Observing of the Bavarians, which is included in his collection of writing, Shujin, collected writings from hidings. My talk today is based on this literature.
Fujiwara Seika met Hwang in 1598, and over the following year and a half, they deepened their friendship. Fujiwara asked Hwang to hand copy the 4 books and 5 classics. These are Confucianist classics, and the continued exchange centered on the Confucian works. The image shown on the slide is the Great Learning, one of the 4 books and 5 classics, copied by Kanhan, which is now held in Japan's Cabinet Library and publicly viewable. At the end of the book appears Kanhan's signature in the portion marked by the blue frame. It reads, the last part, Jihai Jinmin, former Assistant Minister of Punishments of Joseon, Chong Kang-han postscript. So, Jihai, Tsuchi no Toi, corresponds to 1599. So this is dated April 5th, 1599. So I'm going to talk about the time that starts around 1600. At first glance, it may seem extraordinary leisurely that in a time of war, a Japanese monk, Fujiwara Seika was a monk, and a Korean Confucian scholar would spend their days discussing Confucian texts. Why then were they engaged in such an activity that appears so leisurely? And how should we understand their intellectual exchange, which took place in the midst of wartime? Let's think about this theme together. Looking at Kanhan's evaluations of Japanese politics and intellectuals, we see, and this is predictable, that he judged Toyotomi Hideyoshi negatively. By contrast, he spoke very highly of Fujiwara Seika, praising him as follows: extremely intelligent, understanding the classical writings, and has mastered every book. We may infer that based on this high evaluation, the two engaged together in activities such as copying the 4 books and 5 classics, while they discussed these classics. Indeed, Fujiwara added Kunten reading marks to the copies written by Kanhan, and these texts with the Kunten are said to have played a role as a starting point for Zushi studies in the Tokugawa era. To supplement from the perspective of the history of Chinese philosophy, it was in the Song dynasty under Zushi that the 4 books and 5 classics came to be firmly established as Confucian canon. In other words, through Kanhan, brought to Japan as a prisoner of war, Fujiwara Seika sought to learn part of the Zushi learning that had developed in China. Fujiwara Seika was someone so passionate about learning that he even considered traveling to Ming China to study Zushi's teachings. Even before the war, he had been engaging in discussions on Zushi learning with Korean envoys. In the extraordinary context of wartime, he met Kanhan, and through debates on the interpretation of the Confucian classics, he learned new interpretive methods developed by Song dynasty scholars, gradually shifting his thought toward Zushi learning. In 1604, Fujiwara Seika, when he was granted an audience with Tokugawa Ieyasu, he took off his monk's robes and donned the Confucian attire and lectured on Zushi learning. So how should we interpret the encounter between Fujiwara and Kanhan? To approach this question, let us first consider Hayashi Razan, Fujiwara's disciple and the representative Confucian of the Tokugawa shogunate. So, Hayashi Razan described Fujiwara Seika as the source of Japanese Confucianism. This is an assessment from the broader perspective of intellectual history. However, beyond such an intellectual history perspective, I'd like to emphasize that Fujiwara Seika was deeply interested in the concept of Li, principle or universality, valued by the Confucians of the Song dynasty. So in Hayashi Razan's works, we find the following passage that principle exists is like heaven covering all and earth supporting all, covering Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and China. This passage shows that the Fujiwara sought to think of Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and China from an universal perspective. So looking at the China on a relative basis compared to the other countries. So because of time constraints, I would like to skip over some parts talking about the books. So talk about the Yamazaki Ansai and Hwang. So while Fujiwara Seika and Kanhan were contemporaries and interacted directly, Yamazaki Ansai and Hwang were separated by almost a century. Hwang was born in 1501 and Yamazaki Ansai was born in 1618. Ansai sought out and studied Hwang's works purely out of scholarly interest. Yamazaki Ansai was able to read the selections from Zushi's writings and record of self-reflection that Fujiwara and Hayashi did not access to. So Yamazaki Ansai read the most books by him. So he read all the books by Hwang, but he did not accept everything. So he adopted what should be adopted. He criticized what needed to be criticized and developed what deserved further development. To begin with, we can see how highly Yamazaki valued Hwang from the way he praised the book Record of Self-Reflection. So let's read this passage. Recently, I read Hwang's Record of Self-Reflection and found that it discussed matters in detail. By retracing what he discussed, I was able to understand how these principles could serve as rules for our own academy. After that, I gathered the teachings of earlier Confucians, annotated them under each article, and studied them with my companions. What is lamentable is that in Japan, books such as Elementary Learning and The Great Learning have long been passed down and studied at home, yet I have not heard of anyone who has truly grasped their meaning. Perhaps it's because of the great distance in time and space. Even so, Hwang of Korea, though born several centuries after Zushi, seemed as if he had been directly taught by Zushi at the White Deer Grotto Academy. Therefore, I too feel that I must be inspired and aim for a higher dimension. So the record of self-reflection was not published for others, but was compiled for his own life of introspection, drawn from letters he sent to his disciples. Between the ages of 55 and 60, in the period of his greatest intellectual maturity, he edited 22 letters that he sent to his disciples and contemporaries and used them as materials for his own self-examination. In the record of self-reflection, Hwang held that the most important thing for self-cultivation is serenity of mind. Only when the mind is calm can one see things as they are and cultivate a noble character. Without inner stability, one cannot truly practice learning for oneself. Yet, Hwang observed that many people lacking stability and impatient for results only harm their own minds. So this slide shows where Yamazaki Ansai highly appreciates Hwang. And as I mentioned earlier, he talks about the selections from Zushi's writings. So it's a summary of Zushi's letters. And so this was imported to Japan, and Yamazaki could read this. So he had high praise for these writings. So Yamazaki Ansai, he criticized some parts.
So Yamazaki Ansai was arguably the person in Edo period who read the most literature on Lee Tuige and held him in the highest regard. However, it should be noted that Ansai did not unconditionally accept Tokui's doctrine and saying that it was too highly regarded. I would like to recap the exchanges between the Yamazaki Ansai and then Hwang, and then without seeing the person directly, he had a deep understanding of the Shuji's studies. And then Yamazaki Ansai and then Hwang were not contemporaries. However, through the academic books literature left by Hwang, Yamazaki Ansai thought that it was necessary to pursue true studies. So over spatial and time restrictions, the true intellectual exchanges can be generated. And Yamazaki Ansai was influenced by Hwang, but did not try to copy or replicate it, but continued to learn it from a critical perspective. That is a very important critical perspective in intellectual exchange and community, in my view. Next, I would like to explain the relationship of the third example case between Jeong Yakyong of the Joseon period and then Kogaku or ancient learning school of Edo period. Up until now, I have mainly discussed the influence of the Korean Confucianism exerted on the formation and development of Japanese Jusei studies, or in other words, Korea, due to various rationale and historical factors, adopted Neo-Confucianism or Jusei studies from China at an earlier stage, developed it in its own unique way, and then transmitted it to Japan. This outlines one directional flow of influence that has often been emphasized. However, if we take a broader perspective encompassing both the Joseon Korea and Edo periods Japan, we cannot conclude that the academic relationship was fixed as a one-way path, because an academic and cultural exchanges are fundamentally having a potential possibility to be two-way, interactive. However, it is true that in the Edo era, the influence from the Korea about Confucianism was great, but we need to pay attention, due attention to the influence from Japan to Korea about the Jusi studies. So what I'd like to talk about today is that we should not emphasize only the contribution of the Korea in terms of the development of the Jusi studies in Japan, because the exchanges in academic and cultural spheres are always two-way. And then when I discuss the intellectual exchanges between Japan and Korea, I would like to talk about this third cases between Jeong Yakyong and Japanese Kogaku school. That is precisely to highlight the reciprocal nature of this intellectual exchange. And then Jeong Yakyong was one of the most prominent Confucian scholars of the late Joseon period. He also appears as a secret royal inspector in the 2007 historical drama East Sun, broadcast by South Korea's MBC network. The story of East Sun is set during the reign of King Jeong Yakyong, the 22nd monarch of the Joseon dynasty. And Jeong Yakyong was a highly capable official who enjoyed the deep trust of a king and was considered a promising figure for the future. However, he was suspected of associating with Western Catholics, and as a result, he was exiled to Giljun in South Jeolla province in the southern part of the Korean peninsula. He was removed from the political stage for the next 18 years. During his exile, Jeong Yakyong meticulously studied and compared a wide range of Chinese and Japanese commentaries on the Analects and went on to write his own annotated edition titled Ancient and Modern Commentaries on the Analects. In the course of this work, he developed a strong interest in the Analects commentaries produced by the Japanese Kogaku school, from which he also learned extensively. Jeong Yakyong left behind a vast body of writings about a decade ago, a newly compiled edition of his collected works titled The Complete Works of Yoyudan, or Yoyudan the Chonso, that was published in a systematic and comprehensive format. Through such detailed scholarship, he sought to reinterpret Korean Confucianism from a new perspective, and as such, he is highly regarded in Korean academia as a leading figure in the tradition of practical learning, or Jitsilak. As many of you may already be familiar with the Kogaku school of the Edo period, I will provide only a brief explanation. The Kogaku school was a prominent branch of Japanese Confucianism during the Edo period. It criticized the Jusi studies, which had been adopted as the official doctrine of the Tokugawa shogunate, and advocated a return to the original teachings of Confucius and Mencius. Therefore, members of Kogaku school argued that the Jusi and both of Yaming schools, both of which emphasize the subjective introspection, had deviated from the true spirit of Confucius. In response, they sought to return to the classical text. Accordingly, the Kogaku school was characterized by an emphasis on practicality, historical awareness of social change, and a strongly pragmatic orientation, which lead to say that Jonkan and Kogaku school of Edo period both sought to return to the original text, classics, and then had communalities. In order to understand how Jeong Yakyong evaluated the Kogaku school, let's first look at how Jeong Yakyong evaluated Ogyu Sorai. He said, in Japan today, many distinguished Confucian scholars have emerged. Among them, a man named Mononobe Sohaku, or Sorai Ogyu, is referred to as a Confucius of the Eastern Sea, and he has an extraordinarily large number of disciples. Originally, Japan obtained books via Baekje, and thus in the past was exceedingly ignorant. However, after it began trading directly with the Zhenjiang region of China, it spared no effort in acquiring all of the finest Chinese books available. So, through this direct trade with the Zhejiang region of China, they acquired all of the finest Chinese books And moreover, since they were not burdened with studying for the civil service examination or keju in Japan, their literary learnings has not advanced far beyond that of our country, which is truly a shameful thing. So these are the letters instructed to send to his two sons. So considering this, this letter was written by Jeong Yakyong to his two sons. It is known to have been sent to two sons, and then when after Jeong Yakyong arrived at his place of exile in Giljun in 1801, after his arrival in that year, he sent this letter to his son. So this letter, written by a Korean practical learning scholar to his own sons, is highly regarded as a model of Confucian family education rooted in moral and intellectual values. In this letter, Jeong Yakyong goes so far as to praise Ogyu Sorai as the Confucius of the Eastern era. And at the same time, he acknowledges that because Japan did not have a civil service examination system, academic freedom was better preserved. He even goes so far as to evaluate Japan's scholarly standards as being even higher than those of Korea. Next. So Jeong Yakyong's how much citation was given by him during his exile, I just would like to briefly describe it. So in ancient and modern commentaries of the Anathetics, Jeong Yakyong refers to annotations from Ito Jinsai's Kogi in 3 places, Ogyu Sorai's in 50 places, and Dazai Shundai's Kokun Gaiden in more than 100 places. Even in the case of citations, his approach varied. Some he supports, others he merely introduces, and still others he explicitly disagrees with. And then, so Jeong Yakyong did not read directly Ogyu Sorai's or Ito Jinsai's books, but then it seems that then he learned through the introduction by Dazai Shundai of Kokun Gaiden.
Another thing I like to talk about Jeong Yakyong. So there is this literature saying, well, that he wrote a piece called On Japan, talking about all of Japan. So it offers a comprehensive evaluation of Japan. Let's look at the text together. Now there is nothing in Japan that need cause concern. I have read the works of Ito Jinsai, a master of Kogaku school, as well as the interpretations of the classics by Ogyu sensei and the Dazai sensei. And all are adorned with brilliant literary expression. Therefore, I have come to be convinced that as of today, there's nothing about Japan that should cause worry. So this is believed to have been written during his period of exile. And so it's in the 1800s because he refers to Jinsai and Sorai. And in the 1800s onwards, Jeong Yakyong said that judging from the level of academia in Japan, Japan is not a country to be worried about. So I'd like to summarize the discussion of Jeong Yakyong and the Edo period Kogaku school. As I mentioned earlier, the relationship between Jeong Yakyong and the Kogaku school It is an excellent example of how the exchange of knowledge and culture was not one way, but always bi-directional. Even while in exile, far removed from political life, Jeong Yakyong maintained a deep interest in Japanese intellectual achievements. The Japanese Kogaku masters Ogyu Sorai, Ito Jinsai, and Dazai Shundai lived roughly a century before Jeong Yakyong. Just as Yamazaki Ansai studied the works of Hwang a century after his time, so too did Jeong Yakyong in 19th century Korea. He closely read and engaged with the writings of the Kogaku school from the 18th century Edo era. Both Yamazaki Ansai and Jeong Yakyong devoted themselves to the interpretation of Confucian classical texts, such as the Analects. At first glance, their focus might seem to be on narrow, minute details, but through the interpretation of Confucian texts, they strove to move beyond subjective perspectives and to grasp the meaning of classical Chinese texts objectively. In doing so, they sought to draw out a new world view. In the history of intellectual exchange between Japan and Korea, the attitude demonstrates for us the potential of scholarship in the humanities, knowledge that seems unrelated to practical interest, yet allows us to envision entirely new worlds. So next, I'd like to talk about the fourth example. This is about Fukuzawa Yukichi and Giljun. As you know well, Fukuzawa Yukichi was a leading Enlightenment thinker of the Meiji era. Giljun arrived in Tokyo in May 1881 as a member of the Korean observation mission. The mission comprised of academics. So he arrived in Tokyo, and the next month, in June, he entered Keio Gijuku and started study. And he lodged in Fukuzawa's private residence while he learned. Next year, in 1882, a military coup occurred in Korea, and Giljun returned to Korea the following year in March 1883. In July of that same year, he accompanied a mission to the United States, and he began studying in the US. The next year, in 1884, however, Korea saw the Gapsing coup, an attempt at reform led by pro-Enlightenment intellectuals. The coup failed within just 3 days. So Giljun's friends was involved. He was not directly involved because he was in the US, but he was placed under house arrest after returning to Korea. It was during this period of house arrest that he wrote what would become his most famous work, Observation on Travels in the West. The manuscript was completed in 1889, but due to the domestic circumstances at the time, it was not immediately published. And it was finally published in 1895. So it's the book on the left on the slide. It was published in Tokyo by the publisher Kojunsha. And one notable feature is that the date of the book is given as the 498th year of the opening of the nation, meaning that it uses the era count based on the founding of the Joseon dynasty in 1392. In other words, a book published in Tokyo explicitly employed a dating system grounded in the Joseon dynasty's historical consciousness. that Yu Giljun's observations on travels in the West was published in Tokyo, that it used the Joseon dynastic ear count, and that members of Japan's intellectual community, including Fukuzawa Yukichi, supported its publication, are all highly suggestive when we reflect today on the meaning of what we might call an intellectual community. Back to Yu Kyo-chin's life. In February 1896, there were various political incidents, and he went into exile in Japan, and he was engaged in another coup d'etat, and so he was sent to Ogasawara Islands and confined there by the government. In 1907, after the last king of Joseon abdicated, he was able to return to Korea. Many studies have examined the relationship between Fukuzawa Yukichi and Yu Giljun. Some interpret their relationship as politically calculated. Others argue that Yu's observation on travels in the West closely follows Fukuzawa's book, Conditions in the West. There are also studies that contrast Fukuzawa as a realist and Yu as a Confucian intellectual, highlighting their ideological differences. While I respect these preceding studies, I would like to focus on the intellectual exchange between them, the image of a shared intellectual community that emerges through their interactions. So rather than analyzing what they wrote, I'd like to focus on the fact that Yu Giljun decided to study at Keio. And there was a letter that Fukuzawa sent to his disciples. Well, because of time constraints, I have to omit reading this, but Fukuzawa Yukichi, he had these warm feelings about students coming from abroad, and he made various efforts to create intellectual community. So if you look at the contents of the letter that Fukuzawa wrote, he looks back on his own self decades ago, and for intellectual community, what is it can he do is something that he talks about. Yu Giljun, so when he started studying in Japan, there was an article in the Yubin Hochi Shimbun newspaper. And so as Fukuzawa also said, first foreign students came to Japan, and this was reported widely. I want to focus on the part where it talks about the students coming from Korea, learning Japanese and reading translated books and studying Western literature. So there was there was research conducted in the Western languages, not just through the translations. So the intellectual exchange between Japan and Korea was not confined to those two countries, but it was a space that was opened up to the global arena. So once again, this is Yu Giljun's personal history. So looking at the relationship with Fukuzawa, so he was the first Korean student to learn in Japan. He met with Fukuzawa at the Keio and had private connections. He learned for 6 months and returned to Korea. and he conducted various reforms to westernize Korea. But in the complex political situation, his reforms were not successful. And in 1897, he fled to Japan for exile. So Spencer Montesquieu and others were studied. So Fukuzawa and Giljun were people who tried to create a new world in the modern era. There are many research that looks at the differences between the two. So that's a methodology necessary to analyze the two as philosophers, but rather than focusing on that, I want to focus on the fact that they were engaged in the process of creating intellectual community, where Tokyo is positioned as the intellectual hub in East Asia. So I'd like to summarize. So through, from 16th to 20th century, for about 400 years, I studied the intellectual exchange between Japan and Korea. So through Fujiwara Seika and Kang Han's relationship, it was at the time of a war, but there was that potential for those two intellectuals to exchange. And the Fujiwara Seika, from the perspective of Lee, looked at Japan, Vietnam, and China, and so he had that universal perspective. The second, Yamazaki, Ansai, and the Ifan relationship. And so he read many books by Ifan and respected him deeply. And so he probably read all of the works by Ifan, but Yamazaki did not adopt the thinking of Ifan without criticism. So he agreed to some parts and criticized what needed to be criticized. So looking at the relationship between Yamazaki and Ifan, I believe that the intellectual community should be a space where healthy criticism can take place. And there was intellectual exchange between the two, despite the fact that they were in different eras. So this intellectual community is something that should be an open space that transcends place and time. And also, Jeong Yakyong and the Kogaku school relationship, similar to Yamazaki and Ifan, was a different era, but there was intellectual exchange between these people or amongst these people. And Jeong Yakyong tried to learn from the Japanese scholars. And so in the Confucian study in Asia, China, Korea, Japan, there is a focus on this relationship and the flow amongst them. And from the intellectual community perspective, we need to focus on the fact that it's not one way, that it's bi-directional. And this is something that you can grasp if you look at the exchange from a long-term perspective. Then finally, I talked about the Fukuzawa Yukichi and Yu Gilchun. And so around the 20th century, there was the intellectual community that was developed in Tokyo. So at around that time in Tokyo, there were many Western books that were translated into Japanese, but not only that, Tokyo was the window to the vast Western culture and academia. And so the intellectual community existed there, and that's why between Fukuzawa Yukichi and Yu Gilchun, it was possible to have intellectual exchange. So now we're in the 21st century, and more than 20 years have passed. So there has been climate and environment, human rights. These have become global issues, and we really need to review the humanity, and that's become a keyword. So I talked about the intellectual community between Japan and Korea, and that's because we need a space where we can discuss these global issues between these two countries. I wanted to say that we need that kind of space between us. And so Tokyo, I believe, was that kind of a place about 100 years ago. So it was not just about a meeting of a Japanese and Korean person. Through that meeting, it connected to the space that was open to the world. And so the Confucian scholars from the Edo era, they on the surface seem as if they were focusing on interpretation of Confucianist texts, but actually that was an asset that allows the exchange amongst the various scholars in humanities. Thank you very much for it.
Thank you very much, Professor Yang. Over years, and Japanese and Korean scholars, how they built on their interrelationships and how those relationships evolved over time. That was very interesting content, Professor Yang. So now, Professor Ishii, please give comment. Thank you. So the presentation given by Professor Yang was of a large scale. However, the start of Professor Yang was the recent 20 or 30 years, and the attempt to form an East Asia community, particularly intellectual network. That was the starting point of Professor Yang thoughts. And then once again, from there, we forming Japan, Korea intellectual community in order to address and find solutions to human beings' challenges. So that was the theme. And in order to think about that theme, went back to 400 years of a long history in order to identify the inspirations and hints to try to find solutions to contemporary challenges. I believe that's the understanding. So the 20 years, 30 years until today, that's an internet era. Everything has been changing at a very high speed. So even after 10 years, a world appears to be completely different. So from that viewpoint, thinking about the 400 years of history, it is almost like we are trying to imagine a world which is completely different from ours. But hearing Professor Yang's presentation, I am now feeling that it is not perhaps the case. It's not that totally fundamentally different, because 400 years ago, Fujiwara Seika and the Ganhan exchanges between the two happened 400 years ago, and that was triggered by the Toyotomi Hideyoshi's invasion into Korea. And then at that time in East Asia, there were a great transformation of orders. And at Tokyo College here, I would like to remind you, we used to have a Professor Kwang from China. And then in one of his books, he discussed East Asian relationships. And then in that, China, Korea, and Japan, each of these countries had different nations and ethnicities, and then established their own specific nation state. That is exactly the history of those 400 years. He said that in his book. So that professor, in a sense, was participating in the current discussion about an East Asia intellectual community that we are having today. But being realistic, that professor thought that it was not very good to try to establish an East Asian community in haste, because these three countries, each of them evolved culturally as well as politically significantly in their own direction, each of them over 400 years. I believe that that argument is quite convincing. But at the same time, why are these 400 years? In that way, China, Korea, and Japan, and I think Vietnam should be included in that discussion, because all those countries had a great civilization sharing kanji characters. Why they divided into different directions during 400 years? Because I think there is a great meaning from that, because that was at the same time, at the same with the era during which Fujiwara, Seika, and Ganhan had their own exchanges. So the transformations which happened during that 400-year period are civilization transformations, and we can identify certain aspects, several aspects. One is a dynasty changes which happened in China. Instead of Ming, Qin dynasty replaced the Ming dynasty. As many of you know, Qin dynasty's people are from Manchuria, northern people, not the Han people. Therefore, there, the authenticity, traditional authenticity in the previous Chinese civilizations, the actor support of them changed. So that was under such a global transformation, and also world vision at the same time transformed itself greatly, because in the Western world, particularly with a company of Jesus, brought a Western civilization and culture to Asia, and so the space, outer space understanding greatly changed, and also through trade activities and this culture also were transformed, being influenced. So that was exactly an era of crisis. We are saying that today we are living in an era of crisis, but back then they were in a crisis of era, and in that context, Fujiwara, Seika, and Ganhan had their own encounter, and then the relationship between China, Korea, and Japan was formed. So maybe we are living as of today in the extension of the situation of that 400 years ago. I believe that's one possible understanding. And also Yamazaki, Ansai, and then Ikuan relationship, they had 100 years of a time gap. And so they had a gap of more than 100 years of gap, but as an intellectual community, they were having a two-way relationship, but a two-way network was.
So the politics and the economy were changing really rapidly, and academic and intellectual community needs to be thought about from a long-term perspective. I think that was a main theme of Professor Young's talk today. So if you look at the relationship between Japan and Korea, if you look at it from a 100-year perspective, how can we position this? 2025, this year, is the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. And at our university, there are several academic events being held to commemorate that. So it hasn't been 100 years. Maybe it's still a very short period of time. Things have changed during this time. Some things have changed, some have not. And with that backdrop, we're having this kind of lecture today, and I think that is meaningful. Let me talk a little bit in a little more concrete terms. So he talked about the Li, the universality. So Fujiwara, Seika, and Kanhan's exchange focused on this central theme of Confucianism, Li, and there was academic exchange between the two. I don't know how it's translated into English. It may not be an easy task. But Prince Li comes from Genri, which is principles. So Li is principles in one sense. So principles, they're always universal principles. So universality is always associated with this. So in the era of crisis, they focused on the universal principles, Li. They tried to rethink that the concept of Li against that backdrop. So about this Li, with the coming of Jesuits, there was a new knowledge of mathematics that was provided. And so it was a time when the major shifts were occurring. As a result of that, when you look back and comparing to the current period of crisis, what is that kind of a universal principle like Li for our age? Perhaps amidst the big political upheaval, maybe we need to rethink universality from an intellectual perspective. Maybe that is already taking place. Like the term democracy, that is a universal term, but maybe we need to rethink this from an intellectual perspective. Maybe that is necessary. Or what is humankind? What is life, including animals? Such definitions may be very significant themes that we have to think about. So it was a really big topic that was addressed by the Professor Yang. And so let's come back to the current age. So he talked about the intellectual community at the outset. And Professor Yang uses this term so that we try to bring it back from our memory. About 30 years ago, between Japan and Korea and China, amongst the intellectuals, there was a movement for intellectual community. And Professor Yang himself, he was at the University of Tokyo studying here. And so he, I think, was half submerged in that kind of intellectual community. And researchers that led the intellectual community in Japan would be Mizoguchi Yuzo, who are our teachers. And there was a Chinese philosophy research lab, and Mizoguchi-san led Japan, and Professor Hyun from Korea, and Professor Sun Kwa from China also participated. So it was an intellectual community amongst the three countries. The research came together to build an intellectual community. That was 30 years ago. So that was 50 years after World War II. And so what was discussed at that time was Japan, China, and Korea. The historical issues amongst the three countries, and the reconciliation, historical reconciliation was a big theme at that time. For example, in Korea, Kim Hak-sun came out and said that she was a comfort woman. That was in the early 90s, so there was a comfort woman issue, and the massacre of Nanjing. So there was a study, and there was academic debate between Japan and China. And so the intellectual debate was tried amongst the three countries in this intellectual community. Regrettably, that ended about 20 years ago. And I'm not sure the reason why it ended, but one trigger may have been 9/11, so that the landscape of the global community has changed. That is globalization. So reconciliation in East Asia was swept away in this big wave of globalization. So the focus on that topic became blurred. And I think that continues to this day. So, past 10 years or so, globalization is now at the crossroads again. And in various places, like in the US, in Europe, and also in East Asia, in Japan, various changes are occurring. And it's a backlash of sorts against globalization.
And in that context, today, once again, newly, Professor Yan's message is that he wishes to create a Japan-Korea intellectual community. This is very powerful. Lastly, including some questions from myself, and what I felt very charming from your presentation is what you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation. We need to change the Japan-Korea relationship from close but far to close and not far. So I wonder why we say Japan-Korea relationship is close but far. Because geographically, two countries are close, and culturally speaking, we are close. But then maybe we do have a little shared understanding. That's maybe the reason why we say far away. And then the foundation of what can be the shared understanding is universality. And then in our modern eras, and in about a few hundreds of years, and the life in the two countries became far apart. In other words, the criteria or standards of universality far away from us and in somewhere else in a third place. And that's presumably the reason why we are distant between Japan and Korea. And then we would like to recreate the relationship close and not far. And the starting point for that then is our two countries are neighbors. And then we, from that, starting from there, we try to create a universality. I believe that's the message. Which I believe is a very important, critical, and a very compelling message, as I said. So I made many comments on about today's lecture, and then only one question I would like to ask. That is the following. So universality, which can be born out of a neighborhood, what is it? Because so far, when it comes to universality, we feel that it's coming something from above, so it feels a little bit distant. But I believe that Professor Yang, you are trying to reverse the vector. So if that's the case, what can be envisioned from that? Because that is a very attractive proposition, and I'd like to join thinking about that. So I would like to pause now. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And Professor Yang, if you could please follow up. Professor Ishii, thank you very much for your comments. So on a very long span, I discussed on a very large scale history, and thank you very much for pointing out many points and aspects. Well, we are running short of the time perhaps, so I just would like to answer your final question. Korea and Japan are very close countries, and for some parts, geographically speaking, some part of the distance are even shorter than domestically, because from compared to the distance with Tokyo, the distance from Kyushu is much closer. But why the word far is mentioned? Well, close but far. This expression sounds very modern and colonial or post-colonial to me, because then close countries are just close. That's that they cannot be far, I believe. Well, there were a lot of different pressures and dilemma conflicts, and that is the reason why I believe that this expression came to exist. What I'd like to say today is that Korea and Japan have been close as countries, and I am using this word of intellectual community, but this word starting from the Edo era and until the end of the Chosen era, from this very long span perspective, human-to-human exchanges and that discourse of intellectual community was continuing throughout those years. And I would like to emphasize the fact that between Korea and Japan, the desire to find universal values and has been always ongoing. Now, if we try to analyze in a textbook manner the four countries, China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, it is often said that Japan was away from the Ri or universal principle. But looking at what Fujiwara Seika did and said, we can emphasize the fact that Fujiwara Seika was strongly interested in Ri or universal principles. There are not many circumstances under which the Ri is emphasized in terms of Japanese and history, but then it is very important as a fact that Fujiwara Seika and Yamazaki Ansai, all the way through, they have been strongly interested in universality that needs to be rediscovered and furthermore. And then Japan and Korea should not stay in a very special bilateral countries, because I am talking about the community, not only two countries. It starts with the neighbors, but then it should be open toward the world. This was the meaning that I put in my discussion today. So perhaps my answer is not sufficient, but thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Yang. We received questions from the audience. I would like to read it out. Thank you very much for the valuable lecture. I learned much. In your lecture, you talked about the scholars, the intellectuals of Japan and Korea, and considering the disruption of the academic spheres and of the two countries overall, we believe that those exchanges of scholars you mentioned are quite exceptional. However, one of the issues since the 1990s, and at the back of the discourse of the East Asian community was the attitude of trying to eliminate the gaps of the general public's perception between Japan and Korea. Maybe we need to go through a different step in order to be able to build contemporary communities and learning from the insights of those historical scholars and exchanges.
Thank you for the question. I talked about the 400 years ago, and we're now in the 21st century. So East Asian community building in this 21st century. So there was the intellectual community 30 years ago. And so I think the person asking the question is saying that there is a gap between these. So what I talked about was about 400 years ago. It was a long, long time ago. And in the 20th century, there was that experience of imperialism and colonialism. And so that is different, and I accept that there is a gap. But what I wanted to say today was what happened 400 years ago and what's happening today. There is the temporal gap, but there was that exchange between Joseon and Edo era. Well, the person asking the question is saying it's exceptional, but the relationship between Korea and Japan, I mean, my perspective, I think, is a minority view. So usually the Edo period is considered to be a period of conflict between the two countries, but Japanese intellectual in the Edo era and Chosen's intellectual, what were they aiming for? And there was this kind of humanities discourse that occurred, and that's what I wanted to discover and highlight. So the East Asian community discourse that took place 30, 50 years ago, maybe that's focused too much on the reality. And that's why I talked about these topics today. Although I did not mention this explicitly, this intellectual community between Japan and Korea, well, we had this realistic issue of the historical textbooks and the territorial issues. But rather than those realistic issues, it's an effort to find more universal issues between the two countries. And I think that kind of effort is necessary, is what I wanted to convey today. Thank you very much. We have a little more time. So you skipped over some parts. So if there are parts that you want to revisit, you may. So I want to, well, thank you for giving me some time at the end. So I talked about some grand themes that I usually don't discuss. So this long span of 400 years, it's a very difficult theme to handle for a researcher. But the reason why I intentionally took up this theme was because 30 years ago, around 30 years ago, there was this discourse about the East Asian community. And Professor Ishii pointed out that between China and Japan, there was that effort to create intellectual community amongst those who were in humanities. That foundation was established, but then before we knew it, it was gone. So I came to Tokyo, and I see that the various academics, they are doing research in a very short span of time, focus on really specialized themes, and they have high level of academia. But if we are to look at the big issues of East Asia and the global issues, so I felt that we need to address these issues from humanities perspective. Well, I have now another question. It's in English. So maybe you can read it on your screen. So for the audience, I will read in Japanese.
What are the outward policy and the political trajectory that reflect the reconciliation and cooperation of the trilateral dialogue between the three countries in East Asia, China, Japan, and South Korea?
ご質問ありがとうございました。非常に大きな問題で私が
So it's a big question. I don't know if I have the capability to answer this, but amongst the three countries in Asia, to have that kind of a cooperative scheme, creating that kind of setup, I mean, is there a policy toward that? I think is the question. So at the outset, I talked about the East Asian community, which happened 30 years ago. So that was an ambitious project, but recently it has lost steam, as I explained. And that's called the East Asian paradox. So nationalistic issues plaguing the East Asian countries, Japan, Korea, and China. So there still remains nationalism in these countries. So I mentioned that very briefly at the outset, and I wanted to revisit this at the end. Why Korea, Japan, and China have this kind of nationalism, and in the trilateral cooperative relationship, why does that act as a hindrance? And I think it's limited to the political relationship.
Because at the level of private sector and the general public, I am skeptical to say that there are East Asia paradox. And toward the conclusion of my presentation, I would wish to talk about humanity or one world, but I didn't have enough time. But the 21st century is a global planetary era. So we should perhaps make an effort to get away from the nation state concept. And then I believe that the efforts can give us a very good forum for discussion for humanity scholars to have a very productive discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, it felt very short. It is now time up, and so we would like to end today's webinar. Thank you very much for your participation.